Well, now that we've got the recording on, I'll do a bit of a review if you don't mind. The question that we're talking about is why are there so few women, especially Western women, in Buddhism? And part of the answer to that, I would think, is partially due to women's lib. There are, in fact, more and more women coming. Sharon Salzberg was possibly the big mama that gave so many women in the West permission to become Dhamma dudes, really into it, enough to where they dedicate their life to it.
What do you think about her teacher, the Tibetan Trungpa Rinpoche, I think he was?
Well,
He has the
I don't.
crazy wisdom style of teaching.
I'm sorry, what?
Crazy wisdom style of teaching, where he would appear drunk and very controversial.
Yes, right. He was in Denver, I think, for many years. Um, his his teachers and his clan in Tibet would not have approved, and I think that that's part of what was going on. That he was actually became an alcoholic, and the question is, how can someone have the Dhamma and become an alcoholic? The answer is he didn't have the skills, or perhaps he had the wrong genes, or something like that. But his idea of crazy wisdom really is crazy to the Western mind. In fact, beginning to understand the Dhamma is very, very difficult. And so I do not disagree with it being called crazy wisdom,
Mhm.
because
Oh,
from one
yeah.
perspective it is.
You know, I maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he wasn't her teacher. I just read Pema Chodron, another famous author, female
Uh-huh.
author. She's a nun, I think. That was her teacher. I'm not sure about Sharon Salzberg. Just want to put
Right.
it.
Um, there are also in India some women. There was a mother that I went to visit. I don't even remember her name, down in Pondicherry. And then there was a
Deepa Ma.
Amma.
Deepa Ma.
Pardon?
Deepa Ma.
Yes. Hmm. Um, Out of the Burmese tradition, we have Mother Sayama and Amma, who have been famous teachers. In the West, as I mentioned, Sarah and Salzburg, but after her, now there's just hundreds, literally hundreds of women who have dedicated their life to the Dhamma.
If you go to any regular meditation meeting, it would be mostly women, most groups. There are some, those like recovering alcoholics, drug addicts. There would be a mix of, half women, half guys that are into meditation and Buddhism, but all the others, it's mostly women. It's weird.
Times have really changed. It's been many years since I've been to America, and I'm glad to hear that.
Mm.
Um, but as I was saying, because of the Thai culture being a traditionally matriarchal culture, there is a great acceptance of women devoted to the Dhamma. And that generally, the older they get, the more into it they get. But I think that that's true even in religions. Um, Now, the women's livers of the West, when they came to Thailand and saw that the women didn't have the same status as the monks because they were machis, they got all huffy about it, and there's been a kind of a storm that's had very many repercussions. But the Thai women themselves, because it's a matriarchal society, there are overcompensations in the sense that, oh, at Wat Suan Mok, for instance, there was Achan Ranchuan, and that she was really, really excellent as a not only as a Dhamma teacher, but as a spiritual guide and a collector of people, so that the women's area at Watso and Moke is quite large, enough to, let us say, housing for several hundred. But um, that's really an issue based upon um, that in most cultures it's difficult for women to come out of the victim's position. That an example of that is, why do women want to get married? Men want to get married so they can finally get laid. Women want to get married so that they can permanently get taken care of. They understand the quality and the value of family, but somehow or another, the quality and value of family is not the guiding point. The guiding point is that the woman needs a man to take care of her. And that's so ridiculous. That's so easily to be proven false, but somehow or another, that's gotten deeply buried into the society that we're living in, a patriarchal society. And I think that that's one of the things that historically has kept women of the West, and when I mean historically, I'm talking about the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s. But here now, finally, women's lib is caught up with them, and the women feel empowered enough to say, hey, I can get something out of this Dhamma. I'm powerful enough. I'm strong enough. And you see, that's one of the major changes of values that a person has to have, that they don't have to have in any of the other religions. An example of that is within Christianity, they don't even want you to be good. Who are you? Only God is good. That you have to take Jesus as your Savior to be free from your sin, you see. And so everybody is expected to be a victim in Christianity with no hope or no escape out of it. And so within Buddha Dhamma, the very first step of the Noble Path is the step, and it's stated in the sutras like this, that no matter how obstructed the mind is, we can clean the mind out and come to a moment where we can see reality as it is in the here now. In other words, we can get out of the mind wandering, get out of the past, the future, worry, doubt, all of that stuff, can throw that stuff out and come to be here now in this present moment. That's the major difference, you see, because this is what is actually a manifestation of and an excellent introduction to the second noble truth. Because the second noble truth is only about one thing, and that is to teach each individual that you are responsible for your own suffering. It is your greed. It is your ill will based upon the fact that you like things and you don't like things at a feeling level, and that we have those feelings ignorantly, and that's why we get into trouble. All right, so that second noble truth is so remarkably different than, say, Islam or Christianity, because there you've got a God to be responsible. Within Buddhism, we say whether there are gods or not, that in fact gods are kind of irrelevant. We know, in fact, that gods exist because so many people have gods in their own mind. So if God is nothing but a mental entity, there are literally millions and millions, billions, in fact, of these gods housed in the minds of humans. So in that regard, the gods do exist, and they have a great deal of effect upon the planet Earth. But the major effect of the belief in gods is that the God is more powerful than me, therefore I'm not okay, and that God is okay. So within Buddhism, we're going to turn that upside down by saying that we don't know whether the God's okay or not. He's irrelevant. But what is okay is, um, how to say it? Got to get the language right here. What is okay is a new attitude. It's a new attitude of life. And that, by the way, one of the things that I would like to recommend, just as a point in now, that you have had this, I think, is our fourth session together, and that you've gotten enough confidence of the kind of teaching that I'm doing here that it's going to be good and useful and valuable for you. So you might, in fact, consider that you can help another person, because I've got a little bit of time that I can take another student or two on. So if you have someone in mind, or you can put out an advertisement or something on whether, I think you got notification of these Skype calls from Reddit, so you can do kind of a testimonial.
Sure.
All right, if you'll do that, especially women. That I would like to have more women students. Most of my students, almost all of my students, are men. One of the students I have is actually Filipino, a female, lives in the Philippines. But right now I haven't heard from her for a while because things have gotten really tough in the Philippines, and she's had to take a second job. And so that makes internet very difficult. So anyway, back to the story about the wheel-turning monarch. There have been very few of them in history. And that the Brahmins, in their magical incantations or whatever, for the king, when the Sakya Gautama was born, they had these whatever Brahmins were doing at the time to figure out what this, is he going to be a layabout turning monarch, or he's going to be a revolutionary wheel turning religious leader, an avatar or something. And there's one guy that was with him, or the one guy that said that. I think that the king liked it very much because the king recognized that wheel turning monarchs might be good, but there's a lot of trouble with that. Civilizations get into a state of upheaval. So this one Brahmin became his teacher throughout his entire time. Now, one of the things we also know, and that in fact in this regard, Christmas Humphreys was correct, and that is that Gautama was well skilled in princely skills. He was well educated. He could read. He was skilled in the Rig Vedas, but he was also skilled in especially elephant training and horse training, archery, that kind of stuff. So the military arts, he was well schooled in that. Now, if that were true, then one of the stories about the Buddha could not be true. And that is the story that he was ensconced into the palace, that the father was afraid that he would get out, that he would in fact go and be that wheel-turning religious leader. And so the Buddha or the dad kept him cloistered. And that one time he snuck out, and when he snuck out, what did he see? He saw old age, sickness, death, and a monk. Old age, sickness, and death. In other words, he saw dukkha. I don't think that story would be necessary for the young prince to see old age, sickness, and death. And that in fact there is a sutta which points out that that's a story that the Buddha told Ananda, and it's not actually a historical issue with the Buddha himself. That no, he was a warrior. He was big. Tanisaro estimates that he was 6'4", a giant, literally. Um, and that the golden skin complexion also just merely points out that he was of Aryan race and not the dark skinned of the Dravidians of the Indian subcontinent. Uh, so there are basically now two different avenues of stories about the Buddha. There is the actual history that the Indian historians have been able to dig up through archaeology, through all kinds of old written evidence, and just a university mindset, versus this entire magical system that has grown up around the Buddha. And that sometimes these things merge and meet, and sometimes they separate. Uh, but one thing for sure, and that is that we know with really solid hard evidence that there was such a person as Gautama the Buddha, that he was in fact a religious leader, that he was in fact friendly to and well known by both King Pasenadi of our Rajgiri and of King Bimbisara. I might have, no, King Bimbisara was in Rajgiri because that became the capital eventually of Sok. And Asok was of the lineage of Bimbisara. Um, and Pasenadi was of Magadha. And when we use the word, by the way, the word Pali in the sense of Pali language, the word Pali is not a language. The actual language was Magadha, and it has become modern day Bengali. And so, if you want to understand Pali really well, Bengali is the place to go because the remnants of it is there, just like a good place to study ancient Greek is by going to the modern country of Greece. That's the closest you've got. For some reason, Latin and Italian are not exactly the same like that. The Spanish seems to be even closer. So, um, he was well-known historical figure, and that the Sangha has a very strong history. There has, and the history has been of writing. One of the stories that they have is that, and this is a Sri Lankan story, that the Pali Suttas weren't written down until the first century. That's not really the case. What they're really indicating was is that it was finally all written down, collected together at one point. But that even in the time of the Buddha, there was writings. We know of several different works that would, if they had been not written down at the time that they were written down, they would have never ever gotten written down because no one would have bothered to memorize them. The two works that I'm talking about is the Gita and the Gita. The Gita is the poems of the nuns. And you can imagine that unless the nuns themselves wrote this stuff down in the time of the Buddha, that are collected at least from the very beginning, they would have never gotten written down. The first century Sri Lankans would not have gone to find people who knew those, had memorized that stuff. No, it was already written down by then. Possibly the best one, as an example, would be either the Udana or the Sutta Nipata, because the Sutta Nipata has the teachings of the Buddha, but they're in a really primitive framework. An example of that is the Paticca Samuppada is clearly stated in the Sutta Nipata, but it's not either called the Paticca Samuppada, nor does it have all of the 12 steps. That the 12 steps were developed, I think, over the lifetime of the Buddha as he was teaching. more and more. And so these are several indications that what we have of the Buddha is more or less trustable because we've got all of this evidence and counter evidence and proof and whatnot. We also, going back to the issue of women, we also understand that whether I do not know whether the society of the Buddha is in the time of the Buddha was matriarchal or patriarchal, but I imagine that it was patriarchal simply because one, it's patriarchal today, and two, it's evidence of the chauvinism that existed in the time of the Buddha, and that he was reluctant to allow women, not because of the women themselves, but because he was trying to build an organization and he thought that having women in it would have many monks who might want to join turn up their nose and say, I don't want to have anything to do with it because of my own bad ways of thinking. Uh, but there became a tradition, and the tradition is that a student has to ask his master 3 times before he gets permission. Now, in the West, a no is a no. You go to your daddy and say, Daddy, can I go out tonight? And daddy will say no, and that's it. But they don't understand this tradition. Hey, if you go and pester your daddy enough, he'll let you do it. And this is exactly what happened with Ananda. Ananda went to the Buddha 3 times to say, let us have bhikkhunis. And Dhammadina was the very first one. But after that, there has been one of the situations, by the way, with Thailand is that the Bhikkhuni Sangha just did not get established here. It never existed here. To where in Sri Lanka it did exist. Dhammadina was in Sri Lanka. And so for some reason or another, in Sri Lanka, the Bhikkhuni Sangha died out, but it was easy to get it restarted because there was the roots of it having been there. To where in Thailand, there was never any roots of any bhikkhunis. There was never any bhikkhunis in old or ancient times. And so the Sangha in Thailand was reluctant to get it started. But that the important point is the student herself. Why would a woman want to meditate? Because her motives are going to be a bit different than that of a man. And so if we can, if the lady has the right motivation or intention, women can often move through the path faster than the guys do, partly because they've got a better attitude about it, or they have a better view of what's going on. An example of where men get often sidetracked is they get sidetracked into scholarship, into who knows the Dhamma better, who memorizes, or and some of them are the scholarship is all in memorization. Others is scholarship in the sense of broadly read, and Westerners go for broadly read. But there are occasions, and in fact, the last time I know about it, this is a very interesting point. In 1954 through 1956, they had the Sixth World Conference of Buddhism held in Rangoon, and that the 3 main stars of the show were Sri Lanka, Burma, and Thailand, but all of them were represented. Now, I've told you about Bhikkhu Buddhadasa before, I'm sure. I always mention him. I can't do without it. Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was the Thai representative for Thailand. He was already that strong, that powerful, that well known, so that he was the leader of the delegation. And he gave both the opening and the closing remarks at the conference. But the point that I'm wanting to make is that there were um, two side issues that were going on throughout the conference. Besides the conference with whatever conference business that the head monks wanted to do, over in the wings were basically chanting contests of who knew how much of the chants. And the Thais had one from Wat Po, and the Burmese had one there, and each one was in a different Dhamma hall. And both of these men, over a course of months, were able to recite the entire Tripitaka. That is unbelievable because that's like an entire bookcase of books of 45. And two different monks from two different traditions had the whole show memorized. That's unbelievable. But I wonder if it's noble. Would these two monks not have been better to actually have become living that Dhamma rather than memorizing it? That's a question. I don't know. But we do have that kind of sidetrack for men. And I do not see the women becoming scholars. Um, Another one is getting sidetracked by writing books, which is actually part of the scholarships. The scholars can go so left hand turn that they can actually start not only reading all of the books, they're actually out there writing more of them. Believe me, we have enough Buddhist literature. We do not need any more, even if one becomes a bestseller. What Bhikkhu Buddhadasa had and the sutras themselves, and that's enough. One teacher. However, as you can see, there is now an explosion of Buddhist literature. One of the problems with the explosion of the Buddhist literature in the West is that it's not noble. It's mostly coming from the Buddhist religion that has grown up around the noble Dhamma. And that it could be said that the noble Dhamma um, ran into hard times, that it was very strong from basically the time of the Buddha just exploding, and it really had a major explosion in the time of Ashoka. But it started to wane then after the change of the millennium and became increasingly under pressure by the 5th century. And when the Moguls came, the Mogul, the Muslims and the Brahmins colluded together to basically wipe Buddhism out. They say that it's between 80 and 100 million were killed. I'm not sure of those figures. I wasn't there then, but I do know that monks will do several things when the monastery is being burned and attacked. One is they'll head for the hills, and two, they'll change clothes. But they're not all going to stay around and get executed because they don't have that built into the culture the way that some Christians with martyrs and being fed to the lions and all of that. So as far as I know, Buddhism doesn't have any of that kind of stuff. That in fact the Buddha has a recommendation that there are places where a monk should not live, and that is in a war zone, in a famine, in pestilence, which means that there's a lot of sickness. And the fourth one I think would be flooding. But in any case, if a place is inconvenient for the people to live, then a monk shouldn't be there because it's going to be even more inconvenient for the people to take care of him. So in that regard, Buddhism got destroyed, but I don't think that it got actually destroyed, more just sort of dismantled, taken apart. And we know uh, that there was actually quite a surprise, and that is that Zen Buddhism got a real kick about that same time, which was also about the same time that the shogunate had unified Japan, so that the martial artists, the samurai, were kind of out of business at the same time when Zen marched in almost en masse. It's almost like I imagine that a lot of Indians went all over the place, and that's when Buddhism really got kicked off in northern Asia. Is during those times. To where with Thailand, we know that it was here long before that. Strong, strong evidence of an entire Buddhist civilization from the 700s. Um, so with this history of Buddhism, we have a parallel path. There has been the path of the structural Buddhism and the structural Sangha and the way that things looked from the outside. And then there was an inner core of the real teachings of the Buddha. And that what it wound up happening is that the teacher wasn't going to teach the Noble Dhamma to the student until the student started asking the right questions. And that's how it evolved. And so the nobility has been strong. In fact, I had made a major mistake in my life when I came across and understood what nobility of the Buddha was really all about. I assumed, like so many others, I already had the idea that it was very rare. And that Bhikkhu Buddhadasa was like the reestablisher of the Noble Dhamma in Thailand. But when I was a monk in the United States, I had the opportunity to travel to a lot of different monasteries, mostly Lao, but also Cambodian and Sri Lankan and Burmese. And what I was really struck by, for instance, within the Thai, it was really easy for me to figure out who was noble and who was not noble very quickly by just mentioning Bhikkhu Buddhadasa's name and look at their expression. That was easy to do, to figure out but later I began to understand that this nobility was not just in the Thai Sangha, that it was rooted in and available through Laos, that I met Lao, and that in fact I had a remarkable thing that happened. I don't want to talk too much about it, but there's a family, three brothers. Two brothers were monks. One brother was not, but he had a son, and that son became a monk. That son became a student of mine, and I taught him the Noble Dhamma without even thinking about that he's going to go trot right over to his uncle's to verify everything that I'm teaching. And he eventually told me that yes, that because I asked, they told me, and that they agreed that what I was teaching was correct, but in the Lao system, it's more buried, so that the student really does have to ask. But since he went and asked his uncles, they verified it. Now, one of his uncles was the abbot of a Wat in Denver, Colorado, and he was the second ranking most superior monk of the Lao tradition in the United States. And I also have been with the most, let us say, senior monk, who was which was Achan Bunmi at Wat Lao, Washington D.C. And that when I was there, he heaped a lot of praise upon me for some reason or another, and I even have a whole bag of little trinkets that he gave me then. But it was because of this connection, that how in the world could this Farang monk actually become knowledgeable of the Noble Dhamma. And it was because of my own teacher, but it was not that lost. Later, after that, I began to understand that in North Carolina there was a Burmese Wat, and by me talking to the Burmese man or the abbot of that temple, he too was noble. The same thing with Sri Lankan, that the Sri Lankans have nobles also. And that was a surprise. That really was a surprise because of all of the stuff that I've heard from the West of, oh, how difficult it is and how um, uh, it's died out and nobody understands the Buddha, that the sutras have been too corrupted, etc., like that. And the only thing that's left is the religion of the Buddha, and that the Noble Dhamma has somehow become so obscure that it's been somehow lost. And I'm here to tell you, ain't true. I know literally dozens of nobles that I have met and confirmed that they are noble. And I guess you could say it from the position of it takes one to know one. They know how to ask the right questions. But also, it's very, very well laid out in the suttas is exactly the steps that are needed. And I'm going to be over time walking you directly through what step by step that it takes. Now, the first noble step is that step that is, let us call it budding self-responsibility. That we no longer can blame anybody for anything anymore. And you can see, and we do so happily. We say, no, nope, not going to blame anybody anymore because all of the problems that I've got are self-manufactured. That's that second noble truth. And that's why it's noble, because it's always the case. In fact, within Christianity, they're looking for a capital T truth, something that's true for all time, something magical and wonderful. To where in Buddhism, we don't call it capital T truth, but we do talk about it as noble because it's always the case. Humanity has always suffered. That humanity suffers because we create our own suffering. The third noble truth is not everybody suffers, and no one suffers all the time. Some people suffer less, and from time to time, everybody is not suffering. If they were suffering 100% of the time, all of the time, they would be dead already. And that there is a path to come out of that suffering that is momentary, and through the path that has to do a lot with to remember to be here now, to wake up. And other aspects of that path is what will teach us to become free from suffering, maybe not 100% of the time, but that we're sharp enough so that we're only in suffering for 1 or 2 seconds, and then bango, we're right back out of it because we woke up to say, hey, this is suffering. I'm out of here. And so that's the path that we take, and it's a noble path, and the nobility of the path has always been there. The Buddha talked about it like that he only discovered an old path that had always been there, that he did not manufacture something. There's also a very interesting sutta, it's 108 in the Majjhima Nikaya, and this sutta is extremely interesting because it is after the Buddha's death, and most likely after the first council. It could have been between the first, after the Buddha's death and the first council, and we know that because that's the discussion of this particular sutta. It's with Ananda and a Brahmin, and that they're discussing the Buddha's death, and the Brahmin is asking the Buddha what's different and unique between the Buddha himself and all of the other arahats, all of the other nobles who understand what the Buddha was saying. And Ananda said this, and it's actually in two different places in the sutta, and it's most emphatic that the only thing about the difference between a Buddha and a noble is that the Buddha found this old path and was able to give it out. Once someone arrives on that path and is living that path, then we are at the same station of the Buddha. That we're good friends, nobles together. We do it with great respect. I have enormous respect for Bhikkhu Buddhadasa and enormous respect for the Buddha, and also Achan Po. But Achan Po is still alive, and I consider him a friend, and I'm not even sure which is stronger, the friendship or the respect. But with the Buddha, we have to respect him because he was the one who found this path and was able to give it out in a way that others of his station who were at that state of nobility were not able to put it together in a way so that it could be taught. For instance, Socrates had a major influence on ancient Greece, but it didn't really change the entire society the way that it did from the time of the Buddha until the time of Ashoka. All right, it did not have that kind of influence. The same way with Jesus. When we see what Jesus said, only a noble can say those things. But he did not say it in a way where the students themselves got it, understood it. In fact, he told them that you guys are not getting this. Even when I explain what the parables mean, you're still not getting it. All right. But someone who is noble can go back and read Jesus and recognize that's noble. What Jesus was saying was noble. Another example would be Eckhart Tolle. Have you ever heard of his name? Okay. Eckhart Tolle could see suffering, and he wanted out of it. And he got out of it. And part of the example was that he spent, 2 years on a London park bench. But when it came time for him to teach, he had nothing to teach. He even says that he had to read Buddhism in order to talk about what he did. So that's what makes the Buddha so special is that he was able to put together a path that can be disseminated. And what Bhikkhu Buddhadasa did in the 1930s was he started to take it out of the secret backyard of the temple and bring it out public. And he got into a lot of trouble for doing that. They even had a Sangha Dasasa, a huge council in Bangkok, but there were enough nobles on the council so that they could teach some of the other nobles on the council, because a man can be a monk for 40 years and still not ever get the Dhamma. That's possible. And it's also possible for someone to get the Dhamma and to not ever become a monk. That's also possible. So you can see that with these possibilities, so they wound up not chastising him for teaching anything wrong. That was the original issue, is, hey, what you're teaching is, don't teach that. That's not what we know. And they had to modify that into, don't teach this because this is secret. Don't teach this. It should not be let out. Well, that's like looking at a cup that has just fallen off the table onto the floor and broken, and we look down at that cup and saying, that cup shouldn't be broken. Sorry, it's out now. The cat's out of the bag, the horse is out of the barn, and it's out. And so they accepted that the teaching of the Buddha, the real teaching of the Buddha, is now going to be outwardly given. And in Thailand, there are literally tens of thousands of people who understand the teaching of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa. And in fact, 20 years ago, it would be hard to find an adult who didn't know the name of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa. Now that he's been dead to some 25 years, when I talk to people about it, a lot of people don't know his name because times have changed. Uh, but the old people do, especially here in the South. Everybody knows Bhikkhu Buddhadasa. Uh, so, what happened? Fast forward now to a few years. Um, let us, I think, 2014, when I got into a conversation with Achan Po, and Achan Po has always said, you go teach the Dhamma, and he always has a list of places. One of them is always Chicago, because there's a big temple in Chicago that is associated with Bhikkhu Buddhadasa. He's also mentioned Phuket because there was a student of Bhikkhu Buddhadasa that I knew. His name is Virasak Viradamo, and he was, in fact, for years in Chicago, but now he's in Phuket, and he wants to set up meditation retreats. Achan Po says, you go to Phuket. He wants me to go here, wants me to go there. Well, I think that there was a conversation between he and my wife, Thailand being matriarchal and all, she put her foot down and said, no, you do not own my husband. I do. And that's where we got the idea, or that's where Achan Po came up with the idea that for the first time, let's put Noble Dhamma on the internet and make it a worldwide available. Those who are wanting to know it will find it. And with YouTube, by putting it out, not just having one student after another who gets to talk, but by being able to record them and put them on YouTube, that means that from now on, as long as there's a YouTube, there'll be this 100 or so videos, and that the Dhamma is available. And so I have to give credit to that to Achan Po. If Achan Po had not pushed that, I wouldn't be doing it. I do it happily, but I do it under orders. Partly because I think this is true for all teachers. No teacher feels qualified to teach. A really clear example of that is in a science conference of physicists or a science conference of mathematicians, to where you see the mathematician who is at the university teaching only undergraduate students or graduate students, he can be sloppy and he knows he can be sloppy and he can get away with everything, and it's still great to what he's teaching. But when you get in front of a class of all math professors, you say, wait a minute, I'm not sure I want to be up here teaching or not. I might make one little mistake, and then that's what I'll be remembered for, is one little mistake that I made. And so, being in that situation, I want to make sure that what I'm teaching is correct so that it's useful for the students to practice it and to see for themselves and to come free from doubt, rather than have a collection of videos that people are posting comments about. Aha, he missed that one. Oh, I don't believe that. Oh, this is not possible. That kind of thing. That's not, because that would not be useful or valuable for the students. And in fact, the fact that there are so few comments, other than the occasional "thank you for putting these on here," that's an indication. There's one guy several years ago, but I invited him to have a discussion with me. The question that he was bringing was when I was saying that in Sutta number 117, under the qualification of what is noble right view, in that paragraph, I was disappointed that there was no one noble right view that was, aha, this is it, the capital T truth, right? And yet in another sutta, the name of the sutta is Samaditi, right view. And in there is a discussion of paticca samuppada, or how the mind works. So one's right view is to see how the mind works, but it goes back to the quality of investigation. That one's noble right view is to stay in a state of investigation without coming to a conclusion, and that I got flack for that. I guess I wouldn't have gotten any flack if I had mentioned Sutta number 9, the Samaditthi Sutta, about there are right views to have, but in this particular sutta, right view is seen as not a particular view or even a particular viewpoint, but rather the insistence to keep looking, keep investigating, keep noticing. That if we come to a conclusion, that conclusion, because everything changes, anicca vata sankhara, if we come to a conclusion, that conclusion will eventually be wrong. And that most of our conclusions are almost always based upon what I call the law of karma, or better called the karma machine. In the sense that if I do good, I will get a good result. I'm a victim of the karma machine. I have to put in something into this machine in order to get something out of it. And here's a clear example of that not being the case. There is no guarantee that if you put in the good work, you're going to get the good benefit out of it. And that is, the United States government is now closed and the government workers are not getting paid. They put in their work and they get no pay. So that proves the law of karma is wrong in the sense of it always being the case. Now, the Buddha teaches, by the way, I've got to call that back or somebody's going to really complain about it, so let me finish that. The Buddha did say that there are good actions that get good results, and there are also bad actions that give bad results. But that's not the sum total of the game. That if that is the sum total of the game, then it does become magical, because then we say, oh, well, a bad action and then the guy died, he's going to have to get reborn or beat up somehow time after death. He's got his coming, the karma machine demands it. But we say, oh, no, that's not the case. In fact, a person being good or bad their whole life is not possible. Everybody is a mix. Then in fact almost all the motivation, or let us say almost all of our actions, are done with mixed motives. We don't generally have pure motives. An example of a non-pure motive is saibat. The women or the people will stand on the road or come out to the road where the monks are to put food in their bowl. This is called saibat. It's also called tam bun. Now, the word bun is like the same thing as bon voyage or bienvenue. It means good. So tam is the word for work. So doing a good work, tam bun, or saibat means putting into the bowl. That has the quality of merit making. In other words, if I feed the monk this morning, I'm going to get something happen way up into the future after I'm dead. I'm going to get a palace or something like that. This is the magical thinking way of it. But in fact, while she's having those thoughts, she is actually missing out on the real benefit of feeding the monk, and that is, I feel really good to put food in the bowl. After all, this monk that I'm feeding is my second nephew. And so I'm doing good and I feel good right now. So that's the real benefit that we need to look at in the sense of karma. Karma has to be built into the cause-effect relationship. There is no possibility of karma working with a gap so that the cause is in this century and the effect is in the next century. That doesn't happen. Cause-effect are really tightly wrapped together. And when we understand that, we recognize that most action is actually mixed. It has both good and bad action that gives mixed results, and those mixed results will be there. An example of that, we call it the silver lining, a cloud with a silver lining. It's called unintended consequences. The military calls it collateral damage. Let me give you a really weird example of a cloud with a silver lining. If Hitler had not colluded with the Palestinians to murder 6 million Jews, there would have never been the state of Israel born. So, was all of Hitler's actions bad? Or was there any mixture in there at all? And by the way, the motivations are from thousands of people, all with mixed motives, because the next question should obviously be the nation of Israel is 100% good? Because that's not true either. It's also a mixed bag. Everything winds up being a mixed bag. And when we understand it like that, now we're getting a very, very excellent understanding of what the real law of karma is. It's based upon cause effect, and it does have our motivations built into it, which means the second noble truth. Greed, ill will, and delusion are built right there into that karma. But the Buddha, by the way, teaches a fourth kind of karma. And the fourth kind of karma is actually liberating karma. And the fourth kind of karma is built upon noble right view, to where all the other kinds of karma is built upon it's right view, in the sense that there are good actions that give good results and bad actions that give bad results. But that's not the sum total of the game, and therefore ordinary right view is problematic. It still winds up in suffering somehow. An example in that regard would be that all of civilization, the sum total of civilization, is good in the sense that what terrible things could happen if all of a sudden humanity lost its civilization due to a volcano or nuclear bombs or whatever like that. A clear example would be the fall of the Roman Empire. That after 500 AD, the world went into a really dark age, or let's see, at least European went into a really dark age. So that was bad. That was wrong. But the right of the Roman Empire was also fraught with problems. So we're only talking about degrees of suffering between right and wrong view when the right view is ordinary. It's only the supramundane right view that brings us to the end of suffering. And that supramundane right view has always to do with investigation. And now I add another component, this fourth kind of karma. So we've said the first kind of karma is bright karma that gives bright results, dark karma that gives dark results, mixed bright and dark karma gives mixed and bright results. What's the fourth one? A karma that is neither bright nor dark, that gives results. And those results are also neither bright nor dark. Now, how does that work? Well, let's look at it from the negative position, the dark actions. We are no longer taking dark actions because we are now dedicated to the end of suffering. Therefore, we're not going to consciously going around creating suffering. So we're going to eliminate actions that are dark. And therefore, we stop seeing, because of, for instance, the blame game, that when we experience something dark, we don't experience it as dark because of either blaming the law of karma or someone becoming a victim. We remain a champion with the sense of, I can handle that. I can handle that. It's not dark. It's just more. And similarly, bright action. Our actions become not bright or not good in the sense that we do things without expectations for future results. That we expect the results to be immediate based in cause effect. So our actions, an example of that would be generosity. Be generous, expecting immediate benefit for your generosity. Now, in the West, we kind of have the idea of this being a mental thing rather than an actual thing, because we have organizations like Red Cross, March of Dimes, Heart Fund, Cancer Foundation. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. Black Lives Matter, etc., like that. All kinds of NGOs, with the idea that if you give a donation to the NGO, you're doing something good. Well, if you go down to the office of the Salvation Army and you make a donation, the lady who takes your donation, it's not going to be her money. She knows it's not going to be her money. I've just given her work to do because now she's got to record it. She's got to put the check in the bank. She's got all of this stuff to do, and she's getting no benefit from that. And not only that, but all organizations wind up being just like every human being. Whenever an organization is organized, it's organized with people, and people bring in their own mentality and they bring in their own instincts. So what happens with an organization is that because of the people in there with their own self-preservation instinct, they give it to the organization so that the organization now's primary job in the world is to remain alive. Red Cross, excellent example of that. Why? Because more than 80% of the donations to the Red Cross wind up being just to sustain the organization of the Red Cross, and only about 20% of the donations actually make it to doing any good. For that reason, it's much better for us to practice our generosity by giving things to people who are immediately around us for their benefit right here and right now. That's the way to practice generosity. And by practicing generosity, by the way, generosity as a skill or as a parami, you probably heard the word parami, it's the first one, brings on a different quality, and the different quality is it brings on the quality of wealth. Now, in America especially, people have the idea that wealth comes from money. And yet we all know that the love of money is the root of all evil. Paul told us that. But the reality of the situation is that the people who have the very high amounts of money, the most wealthy people there are miserable. There are no noble, truly rich people. And yet all the nobles that I do know are wealthy without money. And so generosity is the way to go. And that what we found out about the robber barons from the past 100 years, whether it was Vanderbilt, Ford, Rockefeller, or even modern day Bill Gates, is that they are miserable while they're making their money. And I want more, and I want more, and I want to take more advantage, and I want to do this better, etc., like that. And when they get old men, they say, oh my goodness, what have I been doing? And then they become philanthropists. And only after the philanthropy starts do they start to feel good about themselves, because they recognize their whole life they've been thieves and have been taking, and now it's time to give back. So understanding that, in fact, within Buddhism, they say that the very, very best gift is the gift of the Dhamma. And that's going back to, that's what Ajahn Po has given me a wonderful gift by insisting that I go to teach the Dhamma, because I'm getting enormous, just a smile on your face right now is all I need as the benefit for the generosity of teaching you the Dhamma. But this generosity can be done in many ways. In fact, I've told you about Willie just a little bit. Willie lives in New York, and he lives in Manhattan, by the way. And that, where do you live?
In Brooklyn.
In Brooklyn. Okay. You'll have the same issue in Brooklyn, and that is there's too many people on the street. Is that true or not?
Yes.
Automobile traffic in the road or foot traffic on the sidewalks. Lots and lots and lots of people, and some people are actually there all the time, out on the street, no place to go, homelessness. All right, and that these people are a scourge on all of the other people who are in a hurry to get to walk to go someplace. And so, what I've been doing with Willie, we started out with a quarter, and he's gotten as high as $20 of just giving gifts to people because, especially by making human contact with them, you kind of make their day. And because of that, they make your day. And so generosity will eventually foster the deep sense of well being, of being wealthy, but you get that hit of it every time that you're generous. So, one of the qualities of being a student of the Dhamma is to start practicing the very things that are going to bring on the power that we need. Now, when I say power, I'm talking in the Pali, it is Idya Pada. The word Pada is actually the base. Idya is the power. Now, in Hinduism and in magical Buddhism, in the religion, they speak of these as magical powers. Diving into the dirt, swimming around in the dirt, walking on water, walking through walls, clairvoyance, seeing into the future, all that kind of stuff is kind of magical. But the real power that the Buddha is talking about, and in fact is in the lexicons, the idea can be stated like this: wealth, satisfaction, success, safety, security, satiation, contentment. These are the real powers. And these powers are actually skills to be developed. And that generosity develops wealth, the sense or the well being of wealth. And that the feeling of success comes from the ability to come out of the hindered mind and come into a state to where your mind actually is fit for work. And we feel successful at doing that. Most students, though, don't feel successful when they see their mind wandering away because they've got the attitude that, oh, I can control my mind. My mind's not going to wander away. And when they see it wander away, they say, oops, I don't like that. Naughty mind, monkey mind. And so they stay in the state of victim. So, really, the quality of this power that we're talking about is the quality of coming out of victimhood into the quality of being a lion, into the qualities of this power, and that we've got a number of exercises that we use to bring this power on, but it comes slowly, it comes intermittently, because we have deep foundations of being victims, deep foundations of suffering, deep bad habits of doing the wrong thing that is based upon the concept of I'm not okay. And somehow there is something in the world that is okay, and I need that in order to be okay. And we fail at it every time. Well, when we change that attitude, which, by the way, is a right noble attitude or a right noble view, is that no, I'm responsible and I can develop the skills that I need in order to have let us say, a successful, satisfied, safe, secure, contented life. And I feel wealthy also. And so, what I'm offering you is, let us say, a kind of an additional plan of attack. And that new plan of attack is to start looking for ways and means to become generous. To become generous with the pup that's on your couch. In fact, because he's on the couch, you're being very generous to him. You don't kick him off the couch. All right, so start looking for ways to be generous to your husband. Whenever you see him, be so delighted. Oh, I'm so happy you're home. I'm so happy to see you. And out on the street, becoming generous. Maybe start with quarters. I recommend, in fact, go to the bank and get a roll of quarters so that you can start to be generous. If you see the people generous, as, let us say, see them as suffering, and that you can make a friendly, happy connection for them, you reducing your suffering and they reducing their suffering, that's a really marvelous thing to do, and it only costs 25 cents. As opposed to think about how many people don't like them out on the street. They don't even like the people in front of them. Everybody's in a hurry. So now you don't have to be in a hurry, because when you're out on the street, you're not out there just walking, but you're also out there looking for ways of being generous, ways of finding wealth, becoming wealthy. Now, I see by you smiling that you're probably okay with making this a new practice.
Yes, sounds great.
New York is a really excellent place to practice generosity, and it will gain you great benefit by doing so. All right. And so, one of the things that we want to do also is to keep track of these powers, to remember them, to develop them. That when you're being generous, you're actually developing the skill of feeling wealthy. When you're practicing meditation, when the mind wanders away and you bring it back, we're developing the skill of feeling successful and powerful, that I can, in fact, gain some control over the mind. But that takes the attitude that, well, we really don't have control over the mind, and that's exactly opposite of what we're taught throughout school. The teacher comes by and says, focus, do your work. It's like the child himself is completely responsible for what the mind of the child is doing. That's not the case until that mind is trained. And we don't even bother to train the mind. So much of school winds up being suffering. And if you don't believe me, there's a Pink Floyd album called The Wall. Are you familiar with that?
Sometimes I'm surprised at the things you say, because you say things that I just encountered. My husband put The Wall on the record player a few days ago.
That happens.
Yeah.
It's called synchronicity,
Yeah.
and I have it with a number of students. There's something will just pop into mind, and they'll just say, that just happened. That just happened. Over and over and over again, that happens. And I don't know where it comes from, but Carl Jung called it synchronicity, that somehow or another the minds get hooked together, and it works even through Skype, so it's not electromagnetic. It's not gravitational, it's something else.
That's amazing.
So you know what I mean? We don't need your education. Right. Da da da.
That's the big hit. Yeah.
Yes, why? Because the education is not delivered with joy or juice. It's delivered with a great deal of pain and suffering, and that happens generation after generation. And so, in fact, we teach our children how to suffer by letting them watch us suffer. And then we make sure that they've got the lesson learned well. And then we send them to school to really give it to them. And it's all because of this one thing is that we all think that we are in control of our mind. And in fact, we're not. Not until the skills are developed. That's like saying that every child is born not only as let us say, a rock star or a world-class performer, but that they can prove that to you right from birth. And that's not the case. Music requires a lot of skill development, even for those who are the most gifted. And in fact, in that regard, the best example of that was Mozart. That Mozart was known to be a child prodigy right from his very, very early age. In fact, by the time he was 6 years old, his dad had him on tour. But his dad was really greedy. And in fact, knowing animal husbandry, um, Mozart was born with deep family planning. That his father was a musician, his mother was a musician, a couple of their kids were idiots, and they were, by the way, brother and sister. And so what we're getting at is that even though Mozart was a wheel turning musician, going back to that concept of very, very unique, his life was still full of suffering. If you see the movie Armadillos or some of these, his life was tragic. He was dead by the age of 35. He was a brilliant musician, but what good did that music do him? His father drove him into public performance at the age of 6. So having that kind of prodigy, and I don't know why I'm off on Mozart, other than we expect that from our own children, and we're harming them when we do that. Instead of letting them play at what they want to play at, instead of loving them, we want to make them perform at a level that we couldn't perform at because of our expectations. My dad was like that with me also, by the way, that the reason that I played tuba in high school was because he played tuba during World War II as a musician. And I rest my case there. As well as you can see that, in fact, it's historical throughout all of history that the son, the eldest son, will take over the family business, and he has very little choice about it. And so we pass down suffering from one generation to another, and we do it mostly with expectations instead of being able to see things as they really are. So when we take on the Dhamma, that means that now we're beginning to look at things the way they really are, rather than the way that society has told us to expect the way things are. And then we recognize, oh, well, I don't have the skills that I want to have, but that they are developable to me. Let me see if I can develop these skills. And the skills that we're going to be developing, let me give you a short list of skills. Happiness. That's good enough. All right. Develop the skill of happiness so that it's there. And that we do that in many ways. One would be the case of the little Dhammarato, and I'll talk to you more about that when we really get deeply into the Four Noble Truths. But that third noble truth actually is available. If people did not have that moment of relief, that moment of sigh, that moment of at least taking the mind off of the heat right now, we would all be dead. So we really do have those little moments. The question is, can you see them? Can you recognize them? Can you extend them? Can you, in fact, practice in a way that brings them on? And the trick is the out-breath, the sigh. If we can't do that, then we will not develop in the Dhamma. So, in fact, the skill development does not require an 88-key keyboard. It only takes the tools that you have with you all the time. The breath, walking breath, minding the breath, etc., like that. So, developing these skills is paramount. And so we take that one skill of happiness and break it down into its constituent components. We find wealth, feeling of wealthy, feeling of security, feeling safe, feeling confident. Those are the kinds of feelings that as we bring them together, we bring them into ultimately the skill of happiness, which is another way of saying be here now, being with the present moment. And by the way, the present moment right now is just another rainstorm. It's raining really hard here right now. Can you hear me
Yeah,
with all the
yeah,
rain?
yeah, it's fine.
If I take the headphones off, it gets really loud.
Wow.
So, um, let's end this talk today with this idea that going back to the original question you had about women, women are just as capable of practicing the noble Dhamma as men are, and in some cases, because of the society and other things, they've got actually an opportunity to sort of pass by some of the guys that are on the same path. That women tend to not get sidetracked into scholarship or sidetracked into I'm the best Dhamma dude kind of mentality, or becoming unteachable because I guess the concept would be a know-it-all, and women tend to not have those kinds of issues that the men do. And so now that you know that you can, in fact, gain the benefit, you're already underway. You're already recognizing that this is good stuff. This is the right way of going. And that's part of the practice. Actually, no, that's part of the becoming the sotapan. That's part of stepping onto the path is by recognizing that the Buddha's teaching um, is worth following like nothing else I know. That I found something now that's useful, beneficial, and it's my job now to use this path to its best advantage. That's actually a well-known mark on the path of the Buddha, and that the Buddha recognizes that. And it actually, what it does is it builds dedication to the path, so that we become dedicated to the path. And so, with that dedication, I add one new skill development tool, and that is the skill of generosity. And I want to hear all about it next time you call.
Okay.
All
Yes,
right.
I'm already thinking of